Openers, rotations, 2-minute bursts, rushing. What do they mean, and why do so many players care? And why should you, perhaps, care? Even if you quote-unquote only do content where damage doesn't matter anyway, or what have you. In this guide, I will explain in detail what all 4 do and mean, how to make the most of them, and also why it matters so much. I hope you will find it helpful. And if you have some tips for making the most of your attacks in a fight, do feel free to let me know in the comments. With that, let's start with the beginning. Opener, filler, burst, and execution are effectively the 4 pieces that make up what you do in a fight, offensively, often referred to as a rotation. The 4 parts consist of the beginning, the opener, the building period, filler, the spending period, burst, and the finale, execution, or rush. Absolutely, getting some parts right is more important than other parts, but they all impact your performance in a fight. Typically, the whole thing is often combined together into the single term rotation, which for many jobs makes no sense since your attack sequence does not rotate, but it is a term that we sorta borrowed from the past. The attack sequence in an MMO like this, and sometimes other games, is simply referred to as your attack rotation, or simply rotation. Now, with what it is we're talking about explained, the next thing is probably motivation. A lot of more casual players argue that making the most of your rotation, like caring about, bothering to perform a proper opener and burst, doesn't matter to them, as the content they do not have DPS checks, and if they do, they tend to be so loose that you'll probably be fine. So since the game doesn't demand that you do it, why bother, right? Now, no one's saying that you have to be a god gamer turbo master to play Final Fantasy XIV, not in the slightest. However, the one thing you can practice that will carry over to everything else in the game is precisely your ability to play the job you're playing. The better you are at your job, the easier everything else gets by extension. If you master your rotation well enough, you have more time to look at and enjoy the fights themselves and deal with what comes at you. The more skillful you get at your job, the less likely a fight drags on longer than it needs to, as your performance gets the enemy out of the way earlier, thereby reducing the amount of things you need to deal with too. For some jobs, starting with a nice and thought out opener also leads to the general attack rotation making more sense or being easier to handle, meaning that by simply starting right, it becomes easier to just wing it for the rest of the fight. In other words, improving at any of the aspects I'm presenting in this video would probably make your general experience of Final Fantasy XIV easier or more relaxed when it really comes to it, even if the optimization, because let's be real here, this is optimization, sounds excessive at times. So, with the motivation and purpose covered, let's dive into openers. An opener is very simply the way you start a fight. At its most basic level, when you're low level and don't have many options, for example, the difference between a good or bad opener can be something as simple as making use of precasting or not. Openers are often started before combat even begins. For instance, a black mage can start casting Fire 3 and take those 3+ seconds to cast it just fine, as the fight starts when the spell lands. Add to this that Fire 3 runs on the global cooldown, I have a separate video on this topic, while casting, so that right after Fire 3 finishes casting, you can get straight to casting more. Compare this to if you instead used Swift Cast and just threw Fire 3 from nothing suddenly. In that case, your spell would land sooner, but you would then sit through the GZD unnecessarily. However, this of course assumes that you know when the fight is starting in the first place. Which then leads us to pull timers. It is possible at any time you're not in combat to initiate a pull timer of up to 30 seconds, which is commonly used to indicate exactly when the fight is going to start. This would mean, for the previous example, that the Black Mage would be able to start casting Fire 3 about 3.5 seconds before the fight begins to make sure their spell lands on time. A Red Mage would be able to cast the Thunder or the Arrow early, and something like a Dancer, assuming the pull time is long enough, would even be able to initiate Standard Step 15 seconds early. A huge benefit of pull timers is also that, as they let everyone get ready to battle at the same time, it allows everyone to practice starting a difficult battle the same way every time, making everything in the fight more consistent, and so predictable. Some things, like the early Standard Step for Dancers, gives them a slight advantage in damage potential compared to if they didn't do it. However, pull timers are pretty rare outside of actually hard content. Why in the world would you do a pull timer for Garuda Hard, let alone a 15+ second one? That alone would possibly increase the total length of the duty by over 10%. That's ridiculous. Which of course means that understanding what you're setting out to do, what the purpose of your opener is crucial. That way, you know how to start an opener without a pull timer. And openers generally exist to do two things. Just two. First, they either set up anything that your job needs to get going, or kickstarts it to get to the good part as fast as possible. Second, it aims to maximize the damage you can do during any potential damage increasing party buffs your party might have, often referred to as simply raid buffs. Raid buffs can each buff damage output by like 5%, and they stack together for a greater whole. Now, for the first part, a warrior opens a fight by setting up Surging Tempest. A Pictomancer leads with a pre-casted Rainbow Drip, technically optional without a pull timer, and then aims to get Morg of the Ages ready as fast as possible for the burst. A Viper sets up their speed and damage buffs. On the other hand, a Black Mage needs nothing set up really, so they just jump straight to fire and maximizes Flare Star casts. For the second part, many jobs have access to raid buffs. These, at the time of making this guide, always last precisely 20 seconds and have 2-minute cooldowns. I guess this is a kind of foreshadowing. As a result of many jobs needing something like 2 to 3 GZDs to set up, like the warrior example, or the fact that, say, a Dancer, even with the pull timer, still would need about 6 or 7 seconds before technical finish comes out the door. Because of this, most optimized openers plan for that, and so even jobs that don't need anything set up hold for about 3 GZDs before going full blast. To round out this particular section, let's take a quick look at an opener example of a job that makes use of some of these properties we've discussed. An optimal opener for Samurai can use Make Your Shisui as early as 14 seconds before fight starts, as this enables them to get a better burst about 6 minutes into a fight, assuming everything goes right. Yes, 6 minutes. Once the battle begins proper, they open with Gecko, Kasha, and Yukikaze, setting up both of their buffs and preparing their stickers. At this point, raid buffs should be coming up, and then they essentially use everything they have. Near the tail end of their opener, they even use Hisatsu Gyoten, their gap closer, simply because it is cheaper than Shinten, to try and stuff a little bit more damage into the potential raid buffs. Some of you probably also noticed that the opener is longer than the 20 seconds a raid buff would be, and this is because openers and some bursts often employ gem drafts, which are potions that give you a temporary damage boost, which are often used in harder content like Extremes and Savage. I'm not going to get too deep in the details of the Samurai opener, as it is probably good enough to recognize that the Samurai uses every damage dealing cooldown and resource they have before getting to their filler. Which is also the part in the rotation that is also the simplest to understand, I would say. The filler is simply where you sit and build resources if your job happens to do that. Otherwise, you simply do whatever you can do to keep up the damage while possibly maintaining buffs and whatnot. When optimizing, during the filler, you essentially only spend if not doing so will cause you to waste resources. For example, during a Dark Knight's filler rotation, they only need to use Edge of Shadow if Dark Side is running out or if they're about to hit full MP. And they only use Blood Spiller if they're going to overcap on Blood Gauge. This idea expands to all other jobs as well. You spend resources that otherwise go to waste, and the rest you just sit on. The point of stockpiling resources like this is to maximize the value of your bursts. Which is where we're going next. A burst, effectively, is the time frame where your job spikes up as you bring forward all of those resources you stockpiled earlier. Some jobs have personal damage buffs that come up every minute, such as Paladin's Fight or Flight or Gunbreaker's No Mercy. For these kinds of jobs, you commonly have both a small, odd minute burst, as well as a big, even minute burst. For the rest, they still have the big burst, but the rest of the rotation is more flexible. Sometimes a job just has a burst every minute, and the bigness of the burst is decided by the fact the even minute burst aligns with raid buffs, making it bigger. Notably, Paladin just has a burst every minute, while Gunbreaker's Bloodfist makes their even minute burst significantly bigger. Now, most of the time, there is an optimal burst to perform for each job, but a lot of the time, the order of all the actions that need to happen isn't that crucial, as long as everything is used. The reason why these kinds of bursts are often laid out in a specific order is to make sure that the harder hitting attacks are front-loaded, just in case raid buffs end early and whatnot. And sometimes, it's about getting those cooldowns on cooldown sooner. As if you have to drift them in a later burst, you can, but if you already drifted them to the back end of the burst, you can't magically pull them forward anymore. Sometimes, simply getting something used over holding it for the optimal burst is also better. For example, if a boss mechanic causes a delay to any of your cooldowns that then causes them to no longer line up with raid buffs. A fight often has to drag on for quite a while for it to be worth it to hold it for the burst anyway. In short, once the opener's over, using things on cooldown tends to be preferable. This is especially true if using said cooldowns leads to more uses of them than if you sat on them. For example, a bard using Imperial Arrow on cooldown leads to a combined 8 uses of this action per 2 minutes. A warrior using Upheaval on cooldown leads to 4 uses of these per 2 minutes. A machinist using Air Anchor on cooldown leads to 3 of these per 2 minutes, and all the various 1-minute cooldowns, well, you get 2 of those per 2 minutes. For more awkwardly timed cooldowns, using them, again, on cooldown tends to outweigh the value of holding them for buff windows. A clear example of this being Red Mage's Flesh and Contra Sixt, that clearly have been engineered to line up awkwardly. On the other hand, if you have charges on a cooldown of some sort, it becomes a little bit more complicated. For instance, a cooldown with 2 charges that charges every 30 seconds, making sure you have 2 for your burst is important, but outside of that, doesn't really matter. For example, Warrior's Onslaught has 3 charges, so you can use one whenever and still get 3 for the 2-minute burst. 2 charges on 40-second cooldowns becomes even more complex, as this means you get 1 every odd minute and 2 every even minute. A clear example of this is Monk due to Perfect Balance. You get 3 of these out of 2 minutes, but you can only hold 2, so 1 is used alongside Riddle of Fire on the odd minute, and then 2 are used during raid buffs on the even minute. This idea also expands to simpler bursts like how Sage gets 3 Flemmas out of 2 minutes. File this idea of 1 on the odd, 2 on the even for later. We will get back to this shortly. Continuing on, cooldowns like Dark Knight's Shadowbringer, where you get 1 every minute but can hold 2, also enable things like using them as you get them if you need to for some reason, but optimizing typically means you use them in pairs during buffs. And finally, let's say your job stockpiles resources. Some jobs generate more than they need for the big burst, giving rise to a smaller burst simply to make sure things don't go to waste. A simple example of this is Viper. Their filler rotation generates enough gauge to use 2 reawakens in 2 minutes, and then Serpent's Ire gives them an extra one for the even minute specifically. But then at the same time, Viper has no reason to do an odd minute burst, meaning that one of those 3 reawakens can be put anywhere they want it, really. On the subject of Vipers, they also have a 40-second cooldown with 2 charges that is not part of their burst normally. Vicewinder simply isn't even close to as strong as their reawakens, so that makes Vicewinder part of the filler rotation rather than the burst. An example of an exception to the quote-unquote rules. And to round off this section, let's actually have a look at a Viper's 2-minute burst. Leading up to their burst, they make sure their damage and speed buffs are recently refreshed, and then jump into Reawaken. Optimally, they even use Reawaken at GCD before raid buffs come up, as their full double Reawaken burst is just barely longer than 20 seconds. And the burst itself is simply using the full Reawaken combo twice in a row. Again, the important part is that this is the highest possible damage the Viper can do, so they shove it into the time where they get the most damage buffs. There isn't much more to it than that. And that leads us to the final section, which is surprisingly often overlooked. Execution. I mean, yeah, executing the previous steps is important, but execution is itself a step. You may have been in situations where a boss is about to die and you're there like, no, wait, I still have this thing I want to use. The idea of the execution section is to round off a fight in the most effective way possible. For some jobs, this means no longer stockpiling resources, like a Dark Knight suddenly using Edge of Shadow without any buffs or other reason to do it, a Paladin no longer setting up for an optimal fight or flight, a Viper suddenly dumping their remaining uncoiled Furies, or a Monk suddenly using Six-Sided Star to try and finish off the enemy. Or, a more recent example you could say, a Black Mage suddenly using Flare on a single target to quickly skip to the part in the rotation where they use Flare Star. The general concept of execution is throwing everything you have left at the enemy before the fight ends, whether it's because time is running out or the boss is dying. For this reason, some may also refer to this step as rushing. The logic is that there is no need to hold resources for your next burst if there is no next burst coming. The way you do this is simply once you recognize the boss is within a few GCDs of dying, you start throwing everything you have left. It is that simple, really. So, to summarize a bit, the optimal rotation typically starts with an optional pull timer that leads into an opener, which combines quick starting your rotation as well as leading straight into a burst, which is the point where you use all of your big attacks to maximize your damage. Then, you alternate between fillers and bursts with a key emphasis on maximizing the even minute bursts, as they tend to have the greatest value for most jobs. These two sections alternate until the boss or enemy or whatever you're dealing with is closing in on dying or ending, after which point you look forward to the rush or execute, which rounds out the fight with a proper finish. And once again, the motivation for learning these things and trying to do your best, even if the fight doesn't require you to do this damage, is that the sooner the boss dies, the less they can do to you, thereby making the fight easier. But remember, if all else fails, using your cooldowns, at least the offensive ones, is always better than not using them. If you have a tip for making the most of your damage, whether it is a general tip or a tip for your preferred job, do be sure to share it in the comments. And also, I hope this helped some of you get an overview of how optimizing rotations work, or maybe even understanding the reasons why we bother in the first place. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, back in Endwalker, due to a weirdly high potency on Monk's Dragon Kick, they had an execution strategy which involves using it multiple times in a row, finishing with Six-Sided Star. That's probably not too surprising considering Dragon Kick was strong enough that there was a semi-viable Dragon Kick-centric rotation at the time too.